Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this video, I just want to cover using private endpoints for Azure Storage. So what is private endpoint in first place? So what if you want to secure your Azure Storage account from outside world, and you can use private endpoints for your Azure Storage accounts to allow your clients on a virtual network in Azure to securely access data over a private link. And when you create a private endpoint, it actually uses a separate IP address from the VNet address space itself for each storage account service. And the network traffic between the clients on the VNet and the storage account traverses over the VNet and the private link on the Microsoft backbone network itself, thereby eliminating the exposure from the public internet itself. So in this video, we will try and simulate this. So I have a test VNet that I'm going to show you in Azure portal. So we'll try and simulate this and see how we can securely access the storage account data from inside the virtual machine. Okay, that's within the subnet in this virtual network. So here I have a test VNet in place that takes the address space 10.1.4.0/16 side annotation, and I have a default subnet that takes this address space 10.1.0.0/24, and I have a virtual machine test virtual machine created that takes the private IP 10.1.0.5, and we have a private endpoint created that takes a separate IP address which is 10.1.0.4, and that actually helps the clients from the virtual machine to securely access the storage account data. And when we create the private endpoint, a private DNS zone will also be created for us, and that will take the domain subdomain name, something like demo or whatever your storage account name is, .privatelink.blob.4.windows.net. So let's move on to Azure portal. So let me come on to test VNet virtual network that we have in place. So the resources are already provisioned. So here you can see the address space that this virtual network takes is 10.1.0.0/16. And if you scroll down under the capabilities section, you can see there is one private endpoint that I already have in this virtual network. So you can go and check from here itself what are all the private endpoints that are part of your virtual network itself. Okay, so I'll come to that. Let me close this. We come on to test VNet. The left side, as I have already shown, that takes this address space. And when we move on to subnets, so we have this default subnet only. Okay, so and under connected devices, you can see a couple of connected devices here. So one is the test virtual machine, okay, that takes the private IP as I've shown, which is 10.1.0.5, and the private endpoint that we created takes the separate IP address from this default subnet in this virtual network. So let me quickly move on to the storage account that we have, which is demo store ACC123, which is already created. Okay, so on the left blade, you scroll down. So under security and networking, let's click on networking. And here under firewalls and virtual networks, you can see we have disabled the public network access itself at the time of creation. Okay, and under private endpoint connections, you can see I have a private endpoint already created. Okay, but I'll show you how we can create the private endpoint and what are all the settings we can configure when we actually create the private endpoint in first place. Let me click on private endpoint, and Under create a private endpoint, you have to choose your subscription resource group, and the instance name you can provide whatever you want, and the region you need to choose, and next move on to resource. And by default you can see the resource type and resource, it took the storage account. Okay, so we need a private endpoint for this storage account itself. And you also need to choose the target sub resource, whether it should be a file or queue or table or blob in your storage account. Okay, so we are going to look at the one which I already created is a blob, and we are targeting that sub resource. And when you move on to virtual network, so here you can select the virtual network, the existing virtual network which you already have in place. Here in our simulation scenario, it will be testnet, and the subnet, as you can see, it's selected. Okay, so to deploy this private endpoint, you need to select the virtual network and the subnet. Okay, and you can move on to DNS section. And here, as I mentioned, a private DNS zone will be created, and a record will be inserted for this storage account itself. So I'll come to that shortly. Okay, but when you create a private endpoint, you have to integrate with the private DNS zone. Okay, and you have to tag the subscription and resource group is automatically tagged here. Okay, here you can see the private DNS zone that will be created here. Okay, so and then you can move on to tags, and then you can move on to review and create your private endpoint. So for now, let me close this. So since I already created this private endpoint, so I can show you the private endpoint configuration in place. So the endpoint name is demo store endpoint that we have. So you can move on, and you can see this private endpoint is actually taking a address space within this virtual network and subnet, and a network interface will be created in the process. Okay, and you can see what is the private links resource itself. Okay, and the target sub resource, which is blob, as I have mentioned already. Okay, and on the left plate you can come to DNS configuration. Here you can see the fully qualified domain name. Okay, which is our storage account name .blob.co.windows.net, and the private IP address that's allocated to that. Okay, so you can also go to private link section and search for private link. So you can come to private link center, and you can click on private endpoints. Okay, so here you can see all the private endpoints that you create as a part of your subscription. Here I think I have two different subscriptions, so that's why in this subscription you are not able to see any private endpoints that I created. So let me change the subscription to VS Enterprise subscription. So now you can see there is one private endpoint that I created for storage account, actual resource, and what is the private IP that it takes, and in which virtual network and subnet it is residing, right? And the connection state, whether it is approved or not. So whenever you create a private endpoint, a consent request will be sent to the storage account owner, and if you're already the owner of storage account, it will be automatically approved. Okay, so let me close this. So let me come back to, okay, so I also have a test VM in place. So I've already shown that in test virtual network we have a couple of connected devices. One, I have shown you the private endpoint we created that takes this IP address ending with .4, and we have a test VM already created, okay, that takes this IP private IP address, which is 10.1.0.5. Let me click on this. So It's a network interface that's created and attached to the VM itself. Okay, so let me come on to the test VM. So here I have a test virtual machine. So you can see under networking, it takes the private IP address 10.1.0.5, okay, which is in the test net virtual network and default subnet. So let's move on to virtual machine real quickly. So I've already connected to the virtual machine. So what we are doing here is, so I've downloaded the Azure Storage Explorer from inside this VM. This is my test VM. Okay, so we can cross check if we are in that correct VM or not. So let me do ipconfig. And you can see my IPv4 address is 10.1.0.5, which is the private IP address for this test virtual machine that we have connected to. So I have downloaded this Azure Storage Explorer and I've connected to the demo store account 123. Okay, so if we can probably detach and try again. I'll show you that real quickly. Under storage accounts, connect to Azure Storage. So I'm going to say storage account service, and you can just pull the connection string up and pass it here. So let me go ahead and pull the connection string. So I've connected to Azure portal from inside the virtual machine. So let me scroll down and go to access keys, and you can say show keys, and just pull the connection string, copy the connection string. You can just give some display name, demo store acc 123. Just paste the connection string here and click on next. Try to click on connect. So here you can see the storage account is now connected in Azure Storage Explorer. So let me click on block containers, and here you can see I already have a sample container in place, and I uploaded a sample image there. So you can go ahead and try to download. Okay, we can try to download and check if it is working fine without any issues from inside the virtual machine. Okay, now we can see the transfer is successful. Let's come back to Azure portal. So we will try and see if we can access the container from outside of the virtual machine real quickly. Let me come on to storage accounts. Demo store acc 123 is what we are looking at. Under data storage, you can click on containers, and we have a sample container here. You can see the access level is private, and if you try to access the container, you'll not be able to access the container here. Okay, you get this request is not authorized to perform this operation. So you can clients from inside the virtual network only can safely and securely access the data in the storage account. So that's why we have created this private endpoint in first place, to secure the connection over the private link in Microsoft Backbone network itself. Okay, let me close this, and also let me come back to the test virtual machine that we have. Let me maximize this. Let me minimize the storage explorer, and we will try to do a NS lookup to the private DNS zone that also get created when we create the private endpoint. So let me So what I'm saying here is do a NS lookup. So this is the subdomain. We have the storage account name demo store acc123 dot private link dot blob dot core dot windows dot net, or we can remove the private link also and try if it is resolving to the private IP. So here you can see the address it resolves to is 10.1.0.4, which is the private IP address of the storage account, right? So if you try to access the storage account outside of the virtual network, it actually resolves to the public IP of this storage account if you have one. We are trying to do a NS lookup within the virtual machine itself, and it correctly resolves to the private IP that is allocated to the private endpoint for this storage account. Okay, so let me minimize this. So let's look at some of the benefits of creating private endpoints for Azure Storage account. It actually enables you to secure your storage account by configuring the storage firewall that actually blocks all the connections on the public endpoint. Okay, so it eliminates the exposure to the public internet. Okay, so it increases the security for your virtual network also by enabling you to block all the exfiltration of data from the VNet itself. And you can also securely connect to storage accounts from on-premises networks, okay, that connect to the Azure VNet using express routes or VPN with private peering. Okay, so to just summarize, so we simulated this scenario wherein we had test virtual network and default subnet, and we had a test virtual machine that takes this private IP in the subnet, and we created a private endpoint for Azure Storage account, and that takes a separate private IP address from within the subnet, and a network interface card has been created for us, and the private DNS zone also gets created when you create the private endpoint, and it inserts a record into the private DNS zone. So let me quickly show you that as well. So let's come on to Azure portal. So here you can see there is a private zone, DNS zone, that's created at the time of private endpoint creation. So here you can see there is a record that's created for the storage account, which is our demo store account 123, a record, and you can see the value, the private IP value is inserted. We come back to the presentation. So we could securely access the data from within the virtual machine. So we also did NS lookup from within virtual machine, and we provided fully qualified domain name, and we could see that it's successfully resolving to the private IP address, okay, of the private endpoint that we created. Okay, so I hope you find this video helpful. So please share it with your friends. Please like and subscribe to my channel so you may benefit from any future videos that I may post on any of the topics. Thank you very much for watching.